So welcome everybody to the ODDESSI trial research update. We have Catherine Clarke, who is in the team of Russell Razik in the UK. They've been working and researching and gathering data and everything since 2017. And so we have the pleasure of having Catherine with us. Catherine Clarke with us, who's going to share all this with all of us today. And I now see, oh, okay, now the participants, I'm gonna start again because there was a moment that something failed and I think some participants were away for a moment. So welcome, Catherine, to the 26th network meeting for the treatment of psychosis 2022. We have the pleasure of having Catherine from the ODDESSI trial team with us this morning, and they've been researching since 2017. And I want to congratulate Catherine, so everybody can give her a huge welcome and hooray! She just got married, so congratulations, Catherine. And maybe she's a little hoarse because she's been, so thank you so much for being here, and I give you the floor. So
thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Yes, my voice is a bit hoarse, but I think it's almost recovered. It was a week ago we had the big party, so I've been resting the voice a bit. Just to say, first of all, Russell Razik sent his apologies. There was a bit of a mix-up with time zones, and yeah, he can't present any longer. So I'll tell you a bit about myself and the team. I'll go through a bit of his presentation, probably quite briefly, and then tell you a bit more about the ODDESSI programme of research, what was planned, what has happened so far, and what the next steps are. So I will share my screen. And do let me know if that's not clear. I can see some not frowny faces, so that might be okay. So I'm happy to talk to you today about the ODDESSI research programme, which has been underway since about 2017 in the UK. I wasn't involved in the development of the research programme. I've been part of it since about 2018. So it's a very large programme of research with lots of different sections, which I'll try to describe. The chief investigator is Steve Pilling, who I work for at UCL. There's principal investigators in our different trial sites, co-applicants including Costa Kula, who was just talking a moment ago. Very interesting talk. Lots of research staff, current and ones who've moved on already, and various committees that oversee what we do. We have a programme steering committee who I oversee our progress and report back to the funder. A lived experience advisory panel who advise on work we're doing. We report to them regularly. I think it's 3 times a year, and also we bring any problems to them to kind of troubleshoot. And also doctoral students and collaborators around the world. I'm sure some of whom are here today. And a bit of my background is in research and health research, usually in the mental health area. So I've done other trials looking at like a new way of delivering services, often looking at effectiveness over a big group of people rather than the individual work. But I've done a bit of qualitative work as well. This role was the first time I kind of came across open dialogue. So I'm not a specialist in open dialogue. I'm not a practitioner. So this, Russell was kind of planning to tell you a bit about the background to the research programme, which was initially training people in open dialogue in the NHS from about 2013. And I think that from that point, he found, and other trainers found, that actually those staff who were trained in open dialogue kind of became enthusiastic advocates and drove forward the progress of open dialogue within the NHS from that point, which is gratifying when the kind of movement behind this work is coming from people that are trained in open dialogue rather than kind of from above or from being directed by heads of trust. 8 trusts started, so that's the national trusts are a part of the National Health Service. So 8 trusts came together at that point to think about implementing open dialogue in the NHS, how that would be done, could that work? Russell then began discussions with academics about doing, if we're going to implement open dialogue in the NHS, can we do a research programme study, how it's done, how it works, everything that happens. And that's when he got in contact with Steve Pilling, who's my supervisor. They then put together an application to the National Institute for Health Research, who fund a lot of research in the UK. Quite an ambitious application for £2.5 million grant, and fortunately that was successful. I think there was a bit of a mishap because the email saying that they had been awarded the grant went into Steve's junk mail. So it was only after a while that Russell said, did they not even reply? That Steve said no, and then checked his junk mail, and actually there was the confirmation of money with the deadline of the next day saying, if we do not hear from you, we'll assume you don't want to do this grant anymore, which could have been a bit disastrous. I'll go on to tell you a bit more about the progress since then in a bit more detail. So ODDESSI stands for Open Dialogue, Development and Evaluation of a Social Network Intervention for Severe Mental Illness. Research programs tend to need to have acronyms. I'm not really sure why, but there was a lot of discussion at the beginning about how to put those words together to get an acronym that people could say and refer quickly to the program. The initial funding was for 5 years, but as you may have noticed, from 2017 to now is 5 years, and we're not finished. There were delays. There usually are with such big complex research programs, and then of course COVID also delayed us a bit further. It's quite a comprehensive evaluation. It's one part of it is a randomized controlled trial, but there's also a process evaluation, lots of interviews at various stages about different aspects of open dialogue and usual care, and a lot of work initially on how open dialogue could actually be implemented in the real world NHS teams that were in place before this trial. At the moment, we're with 5 NHS trusts across the UK, so that's actually 6 open dialogue teams. The teams are multidisciplinary, so they all include peer support workers, and medics, social workers, various other kind of specialisms or professional backgrounds. We started in 2017, but then had to pause most of our research in it should say March 2020 due to COVID and pressures that were on the NHS. We restarted kind of taking on new participants or clients for open dialogue from August to December 2020, and finished recruitment of the last trial participants at the end of 2021. So that's where we are at the minute. We follow up all participants for 2 years after their entry to the study. So we'll finish those follow-ups September next year, in about a year's time, and then be analysing data for another 6 months probably before the kind of effectiveness part of the programme is analysed and published. So we had several aims, and I guess different methods to then answer those aims, answer those research questions. The first one was just developing a protocol that was acceptable to clinicians and to service users for open dialogue within the NHS. That took a lot of work, I think, particularly by the people that were initially trained in open dialogue to kind of work together to form the picture of how open dialogue teams could work within the systems that were already in place. And that work that was done by open dialogue practitioners took slightly different directions in different trusts, depending on the local context, the local area, to some extent the population that they served. The second aim was to assess the clinical and cost effectiveness of open dialogue compared to usual care. So that's where the pilot trial and the main randomized controlled trial comes in. So to kind of reduce the risk of bias in randomized controlled trials, you have to state at the outset what the primary outcome will be. So what you're kind of what you will report saying, was this effective compared to usual care or not? And the primary outcome they settled on was time to relapse. So looking at recovery and relapse over the 2 years following the person's mental health crisis, and hoping that open dialogue means that time before someone relapses after they've recovered is shorter compared to unusual care. Obviously, not everyone will recover according to this method or relapse, so that will just be a portion of all the people we recruit. The third aim was to assess the organisational changes required to support open dialogue, which the process evaluation team have done quite a lot of work on. That's more of a mixed methods approach to answering that question. So looking at describing the structure of the teams in the different sites, looking at the process by which they were implemented, what had to be in place for them to set up, and also having interviews with staff and service users from those sites. And the fourth aim was to understand people's experience of care, people's experience of open dialogue, how that compared to their experience of usual care. And that's quite an open question, mainly on the basis of interviews with people that have experienced open dialogue or usual care, to kind of draw out a bit of a picture of how it feels to have open dialogue. So those questions are answered in different work packages. The intervention development was mainly done right at the start. So that's the open dialogue practitioners working out how their teams will work, how they'll fit into the local context. We did a pilot trial to just check the methods of our main randomized controlled trial. As was mentioned earlier, randomized controlled trials are very expensive. So it's important that you do that initial work to just check, can we recruit people? Do people want to participate in a trial like this? If they don't, then we can't proceed. That was fairly successful, and that was followed by the larger multi-centre randomised controlled trial and the economic evaluation. The work on how open dialogue services are set up and how they work is ongoing throughout the whole research programme. And the experience of service users' family and the network experience of open dialogue came a bit later. We've got interviews underway now. They're a bit delayed by COVID. So just to kind of take you through what's been done. Initially developing open dialogue and how it would work in the NHS. The first thing was to establish open dialogue teams and have them operating and offering care across the trial sites. That was achieved in a kind of staggered way because there was different difficulties in each site. But one of our sites was offering open dialogue before this programme. And they've just published a really interesting paper about their initial results with the first clients that they saw. The other teams had to be set up. Each team had to develop an operational protocol about how open dialogue would work within their site, which took quite a lot of work. That included things about the staffing structure, that the teams would include peer support workers. And part of that work involved interviews and focus groups initially about that process of implementation. Developing the peer support component of the teams took quite a lot of work initially. We developed some peer support worker job descriptions to give to trusts. We developed them with some of our peer leads and some of the peer workers within the teams to describe what the role would be, and that the peer workers were an integral part of the team and are open dialogue practitioners, as are the other kind of specialisms within the teams. We also developed 2 job descriptions for a junior and a senior peer worker, because it was difficult to explain to trusts that the peer worker role needed to have progression and wasn't a kind of entry-level role and then people would move on. We wanted people to be sticking in the peer worker roles in teams, ideally, if they wanted to. And there was a lot of discussion around what the peer worker's role would be within teams, but that they would be part of the team, they would be part of network meetings and team meetings and supervision in the same way as the other practitioners. So the next work package was the pilot trial, the feasibility trial. So for this, we had 2 teams initially in 2 different sites that did a smaller version of the main trial so that we could check our methodology. So that was started in the summer of 2018 and finished in early 2019. So we had these 6 stop-go criteria, they call them, to meet before we could progress to the main trial and before we could unlock the rest of our funding. The first 2 are about recruitment and retention. This is looking at whether people want to be part of the study and whether they'll stay part of the study. So we had to recruit 10% of our proposed sample, and we had to collect outcome measures for at least 80% of participants at the 3-month follow-up. I know it was mentioned earlier that that if you lose a lot of participants from trials, then you can't rely on the result later. So there's no point doing research that's not going to get a result that's reliable. We chose a primary outcome that we could collect from patient notes and from reports from their interviews and from their family and from their practitioners. So we had quite a high target of 85% for the primary outcome measure, again to protect against the risk in randomized trials where if you lose 50% of participants, then you really can't rely that your result is applicable to the wider population. And we managed to, I think, get about 95% of the primary outcome data at 3 months, which is really good. The consent rate was looking at whether people that get the information about the study then decide to participate, because if people are getting the information and then are put off, then maybe we need to change what we're asking of people. The last 2 bits were about the additional sites. So it was just in 2 sites that the feasibility trial was recruiting participants. And then the further 3 sites had to set up teams, start seeing clients, and establish that they were delivering open dialogue to a high standard. So as you can see, we met those criteria. We made some changes to certain bits of the methodology and certain bits of the information sheet, but in general it went quite well. So the next kind of work package is the multi-centre randomised controlled trial, which is often what's focused on with ODDESSI. But as I've said, there's a lot of other parts to the research programme. This part is the part to answer the question about clinical and cost effectiveness, and then a lot of the other questions around the experience of care, the process of change, this feeds into, but are not directly answered by this. So it's a pragmatic randomised controlled trial. So rather than in a lot of drug studies, especially in the past, where you kind of make sure everyone that's in one arm takes the exact right dose of the exact medication, what we've got is more of a real world setting. So our teams are delivering care within the NHS as they would, as they would usually. Clients are coming to those teams because they're referred, because they're in a mental health crisis, rather than because we're seeking them out, advertising, anything like that. So it's a bit messier than a kind of clean randomized controlled trial, but hopefully it's more then generalizable to the people that might be offered this care in the future. And we're comparing to usual care, which in the NHS could be being seen by a crisis team and then a community mental health team. There's lots of variations to that, but that might be the kind of typical care pathway after you've had a mental health crisis. It's randomized by cluster rather than individual person. So that means if you're in a certain area, that area is randomized to be an open dialogue area. So anyone that then has a mental health crisis in that area would be offered open dialogue. We had a revised target of recruiting 450 people. It's a lot of people to recruit, but I guess if you're looking at the average recovery, the average relapse rates across groups, then you need a certain amount of people to be sure that any difference is due to the different intervention and not just because of something else that's going on. So we recruited over 21 months, a bit longer than planned because of the COVID shutdown, and we follow everyone up for 24 months. We kept our inclusion criteria for participants very broad for similar reasons to the pragmatic nature of the trial I just spoke about. So we looked at anyone who was an adult 18 plus years. They presented to services in a mental health crisis, and that wasn't diagnosis specific. So it's any mental health crisis, for lots of reasons, some of which were spoken about earlier. But one is also that obviously open dialogue is immediate help, and it's not necessarily clear what someone might be diagnosed with a year later or 2 years previous at that point. So we've just included everyone who was in a crisis. And were referred to a crisis team or to hospital or to a community mental health team, but that they urgently needed to be seen. And there was something around mental health, so some kind of, any kind of mental health related issue. Open dialogue was delivered in person to basically all of the initial participants, and then in 2020, a lot of the teams had to move a large part of their work online. So we worked on how to adhere to the principles of open dialogue remotely with some people that are in this conference now. We had various advisory panels and produced a bit of guidance for the teams that were having to really rapidly move and change their ways of working. Our primary outcome I mentioned is from case notes. So it's gathering information from people's medical records or anywhere we can get the information from, basically, which really has proved a really good method to reduce the level of missing data. So at the moment, on the first completion of the notes, they're about 90% complete. We can then go back and try to increase that by calling the participant again if they're still part of the trial, looking at records if they've moved out of area, and I think we will end up with more than 90% completion of the primary outcome. We have lots and lots of secondary outcomes. I won't go into them in too much detail unless people might have particular questions at the end, but there's level of recovery by this method, service user defined recovery, quality of life. There was also an interest in social network quality and size, with the idea that perhaps open dialogue is more effective when it helps a person to increase their social network quality or size or their relationships with the people around them. So that we'll look at whether that is a mediator of the effect that we see. The work package 4 was the process evaluation I mentioned. So looking a bit more at how the organisation changes in order to have open dialogue teams and how they work within the National Health Service. This is more kind of Professor Weaver and his team's work, so I won't go into too much detail about that for the moment. And the final work package, which they're also undertaking and doing a lot of interviews for at the moment, is looking at the experience of open dialogue. So what the experiences of doing open dialogue together, what works, how does it work, and what's different to usual care in people's experience that are part of this trial. For that, they're using a comparative case study. So they're doing interviews with people that have been offered open dialogue and people within their network, so staff or family, friends, and asking about, asking quite openly what their experience was, but focusing on process, change, the context in which open dialogue was offered to them, and any experience they have or any perceptions they have about change in relationships. So it's a really large, complex program of research, which obviously has its challenges. Some key ones have been recruiting the clusters and the participants is always a really key challenge in trials research because you need so many participants. Also getting trusts to agree to have open dialogue teams was challenging. There's concerns with any change, I think, but also specific concerns about not limiting the amount of clinical sessions a person has. Costs, I think, are at the forefront of most NHS leads' minds. Retraining is costly, a lot of concerns initially, but we have got the 5 trusts that have stuck with the trial for the last 5 years. We intended to kind of run for 5 years, and that's longer now, which has had additional issues with renewing staff training throughout the programme. Obviously, people move on from the teams, so we've had to make sure that there's kind of a rolling number of new staff in all of the teams being trained in open dialogue so that the teams don't deplete. Remote working was a big unexpected challenge, which I would say maybe presented less of a challenge than we thought it would initially. So we, in March 2020, as I'm sure in lots of countries, we were told to just basically reduce any burden on NHS that we could. Staff were redeployed from our teams to wards, to physical health wards, and yeah, we weren't sure if we could restart the trial, to be honest. And then it actually came later in that summer from open dialogue practitioners in the teams asking us, like, why aren't we starting again? Like, we can do it now, which was then gave us the confidence to go back to our funder and say they're ready to start, you know, they want to restart, it's not going to be too much burden, can we go through the process of getting we had to get all the agreements from all of the trusts again to restart, but managed to do that with the enthusiasm of the teams behind us. Otherwise, I don't think we would have felt confident to push that. And surviving the changes in the NHS and maintaining morale is always tricky and has been difficult over this length of time. With the delays, we were encouraged, after we kind of provided a lot of evidence, we were encouraged to restart, but we had to then apply for more funding for the extra time that, you know, that this was taking, the extra staff, the extra participant costs. which again was a lot of work, but we did secure the extra, I think it was 430,000 or something, the extra money that we thought we needed to continue to completion. So that's a massive relief, and I think we should be able to then complete the trial with the number of participants we need, and publish the other associated bits of work about the experience of open dialogue. So I guess we thought initially a challenge would be implementing open dialogue. It was not just implementing it, it was adapting it. The definition of crises was a key challenge because it can vary in the different teams, and also sometimes we had concerns over whether a person's level of crisis was consistently responded to, or whether it was responded to more because of capacity of the team to respond. So we did some work around that. Concerns around how consistently a crisis was responded to were made probably more severe around COVID-19, where suddenly lots of the teams weren't seeing anyone present in a crisis, or it was a massive reduction in the number of people presenting in crisis, which didn't then bounce back. So we'll look into what might have been going on there. So looking forward, I think the next year, before we finish follow-up with the trial participants, we'll have a focus on publications of the other elements of the research programme that I spoke about. So the feasibility trial, adherence and fidelity. We've measured the teams, how they're delivering open dialogue, how they're delivering treatment as usual throughout the trial. When I say measured, we've kind of used a consistent way of doing interviews. So we should publish that to kind of get a picture out of how the different teams operated and how they operated over time. We also want to publish the details of how we assess the primary outcome. I think that's really important to do before we publish kind of the main trial paper, so that we can have some scrutiny about what the outcome is, what it really means, and what it means to different people. And then it will be March 2024 before what I get asked about the most, which is the main trial outcome paper. So I'll leave time for questions, but just to say, if you want some more information or to read more, we've got newsletters which are quite good and fun, I think. If it's easiest if you just Google UCL ODDESSI and our webpage will come up, or do contact me or the main ODDESSI email address if you had any questions or thoughts after today, because I know it might be difficult to think of everything in the moment. Yeah, so I'll stop there, and yeah, welcome any questions or comments.
Okay, great. I think if people want to turn on their cameras, you're welcome to. Whoever wants to, so we can see you. And you can post your questions in the chat box or lift your hand. Thank you very much, Catherine, for that.
I guess I was wondering, Jaakko, what your thoughts were about how this fits in with the research that you've conducted that you were presenting earlier.
Yeah, I was actually thinking myself also, saying some words about from the point of view of research in open dialogues. So that from the point of view of open dialogue, of course, all the project of ODDESSI is a tremendous. And being realistic, this is the way that the mainstream work is making research. And of course, having this kind of funding, you really need all these things that you propose that are taken into account in the ODDESSI research. You need to have a randomization, and going into the randomization, so that in my mind, thinking of the problems of this kind of empiristic trials, the randomization as such is not that big problem. But what is problematic is creating artificial laboratory kind of realities in which there is an idea try to have a control of all the elements. And of course, this was part when I was also involved a bit in the planning of the ODDESSI project. And in my mind, this really stays in the naturalistic design frame. And in this way, really think that the people who need for help and they get the help they need, and the treatment and the research protocols are not rejecting any of their needs because they are part of this trial. And this is the basic idea on the whole for me. And of course, the randomization, as you describe, is not the randomization of the clients, but this randomization of the units, so that these people have got the education in open dialogue, and these are not having the kind of education in open dialogue, and that's of course safe for the people, that they can be guaranteed of the continuity of the care, and again not based on any part of the research making some restriction in this respect. So that in my mind, this really follows the idea of naturalistic design, and even if it really has a lot of packets of information, which perhaps may be the most non-naturalistic part of the idea, because of course when you are having interviews with the people and you ask questions and people start to think of different elements that usually are not taken into account the everyday clinical practice, this really may also affect about the idea, mostly in good sense, but of course it's the same for all of them. So in my mind, that you have got, and of course our network also have got this kind of funding by the work of Steve Pilling and you all. It's amazing, but having this funding, I don't think that the system would fund any this kind of research without having the randomization in some way. And I'm really looking forward. I got also one idea, one thought more that I would have liked to comment, but it disappeared. It was not about the randomization, it was about the yes. One problem for me is the training, because the originally actually I could have said also in my speech that the good outcomes of what we have received in Western Lapland are based on 3 years intensive training of the staff. And the training that the staff members have in ODDESSI is much less. And of course that worries me a lot. But again, I think that you need to be realistic what could be possible. And as such, of course, it's an interesting information. What can you receive by shorter time training? So that it's a kind of dilemmatic question all over. So those are my ideas about it. And there is one research project that is not included in the ODDESSI trial, and it's a new project of David Moss and others about the anthropological part of people who have become, that is also very interesting part. What are the follow-ups in the social networks in all this project?